let me introduce Ingrid Kristjanson, who you have been hearing from a little bit already. Ingrid is a farm production extension specialist for crops with primary agriculture branch of Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. She joined Manitoba Agriculture, Food and Rural Initiatives as an ag rep
That's a while ago.
in Morris in 2002. We've seen a couple of changes since then. She recently made the move to the Toulon office and covers the Interlake area. She worked for Cargill Ag Horizons as a consulting agronomist and with Simplot Soil Builders as a sales agronomist. She has a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from the University of Manitoba. She's a member of the Manitoba Institute of Agrologists and a certified crop advisor and a member of the Prairie Provinces CCA board. And there is a half CEU for integrated pest management available for Ingrid's session, and I'm going to let her take it away.
All right, thanks, Tammy. Now I'm going to drive you folks crazy because I got a frog in my throat, but I'll make sure that I've got water nearby. But yeah, it's quite a lead-in to be following Tammy after her presentation. And a little overwhelming, I'm sure. For most folks, it's overwhelming for me to even think about. I guess one thing that I hope you folks aren't disappointed in, I really struggled a lot in putting together this presentation. There's so much material to cover, with all the soil-applied herbicides and the crops, soil types. It's a pretty overwhelming topic in itself. So as I was thinking about it, I realized and recognized that we can't just be talking about herbicides all the time. So certainly when we're looking at a step back for new problems, looking at some of the so-called older ways of doing things, we have to look at the full toolbox for dealing with herbicide resistance. So it's not all about soil-applied herbicides. I probably will cover some of the same information that Tammy covered, but I will breeze through those things. But just keep in mind that as Tammy mentioned, there isn't any silver bullet. There's nothing that's going to come and erase all our problems. These are all going to be management issues. There's really nothing easy about it. I guess it all boils down to is you need to, as farmers, when you're dealing with herbicide resistance, is you kind of have to work even more diligently on your plans and on your record keeping. Those are really first and foremost of the things that you have to contend with, to think about. One thing that I want to note too, because it is kind of an overwhelming topic and there has been so many rapid changes, is you really kind of have to take it almost one bite at a time. Don't look at the big picture because it can be overwhelming. Take it one step at a time and really focus on your records. So in dealing with the herbicides, where are we at? How did we get here? And again, it's not all about the herbicides. The current state of resistance, as Tammy mentioned, there aren't going to be any new herbicide mechanisms or modes of action anytime soon. 30 years ago, approximately, was the last new mode of action. And since then, all we've seen is the number of weeds with herbicide resistance increase, the weeds with multiple resistance increase, and of course the acres infested increase. Now this one has popped out. Oh, now I remember where I was going with this one. Sorry about that. When I was looking at material on what to cover for this presentation, I started to do some research into soil-applied herbicides, into looking at tillage as a weed control method, so on and so forth. And I did find some good resources that, again, are old. It's taking a step back. But if you Google Canadian Weed Science Society or the CWSS, there are some good resources in there. They're no longer in print, but they're certainly available to print off, and there really is a wealth of information. You can screen it out for what's applicable or not. But here are just a few of the publications available, and I have copied these off in the last number of years as references, and lots of good information there. At this soil, let's see if we've got this right. Am I seeing my... Well, I guess it doesn't really matter. Soil residual herbicides, that is a good one. first decade of herbicide-resistant crops in Canada, and new crops and crops with second-generation traits, weed management challenges. So they've all been done in Canada with a focus, a lot of them on the prairies. So good background information there. Have a look. Tammy mentioned about the international weed resistance stats, and Dr. Ian Heap, who used to work in Manitoba at one time, he keeps track of all of this at weedscience.org. And unfortunately, those numbers have continued to increase. When we were first looking at these, we would notice that group 2 as being the most for the number of herbicide-resistant types in the world, and we really couldn't get a handle on that because group 1 was really our first major. I guess I'm not going to get this thing to... Oh, here we go. Yeah, so group 1, which was our major concern, is really quite far down. Group 2, high up. Unfortunately, we are just catching up. So lots of herbicide-resistant species by crop. Wheat is a major one, but we deal with quite a number of crops. And this one really caught our attention. If you hadn't been thinking about resistance, certainly when we started to talk about glyphosate-resistant weeds in Canada, in Manitoba, that really got everybody's attention. And those have just continued to increase as well. Tammy talked about the number of resistant weed cases for Canada. I just have taken a screenshot of weedscience.org of the Manitoba page, and unfortunately it's fairly lengthy as well. So back a number of years ago, I got asked by one of the crop protection companies to help them with a herbicide-resistant workshop for their staff and for their customers. And so I put together a couple of slides from the International Survey of Herbicide-Resistant Weeds. So the first one I did was in November 2011. At that time, 360 unique herbicide-resistant cases, 115 broadleaf. Again, that was unusual in our way of thinking because grasses had been our main concern for many years, and really up until the last few years, we were always talking about grasses. Worldwide, it was only 85 grass species, and at that time, only 51 in Canada. So now we've really jumped. 510 worldwide, 262 total species. Again, still with the broadleafs being the major ones, and but 110 grasses, so it continues to increase. Tammy's number, I think, was in the 70s. I just put 68 plus because that was the last official number. But, from 2011 to now, unfortunately, a big increase. And you folks are all familiar with the herbicide rotation risk pyramid. It's on the back of all the guide to field crop protection that we put out both here and in the Share the Duties with Saskatchewan, for instance. I guess the thing to really, I'm not having any luck with this pointer, so I guess we'll skip it. But in looking at this pyramid, group 1 and group 2, high up top, a number of applications, the reason you get high risk, it's because it correlates to such a relatively low number of applications before you're potentially dealing with the problem. And when Tammy mentioned about 1988 being the first issue with herbicide resistance in Manitoba, we always think about that green foxtail issue, but actually the other one was kochia, and it was resistant to group 2, and if I remember correctly, it was an industrial rate of a group 2 on kochia at an industrial site, and after that one high application, there was already resistance. So it didn't take a whole lot of time to have group 2 resistant kochia, and now again we're looking at multiple resistance for most things. We were pretty disappointed to see that with the low numbers, where we thought that we would have Group 9 and Group 10 for a very long time because it could take so many applications. Because of our management practices, we've gotten there faster than we thought we would, whether it was because of chem fallow or using glyphosate pre-seed, in-crop, post-harvest, sometimes for harvest management. We got to those numbers pretty quickly. And one thing that we kind of forget, too, is Group 10, the glufosinate group. We figured that we didn't really have, or there wasn't much potential for resistance there. But again, it's those repeated applications, and there are resistant weeds to glufosinate as well. And if I remember correctly, that goosegrass in Malaysia example, I think it was 25 consecutive applications of glufosinate, and that's how you get resistance. So, these issues have been around for a long time. Tammy talked about that, and we're still using herbicides, so I guess that's a good sign in a lot of ways. But have we taken the thinking out of weed control? And I think in some ways we have. Farming and producing crops is such an humongous task. There's so many things that go into it, never mind producing the crop, but marketing, storing, so on and so forth. And so it's only human nature to think about the easy things that we can do. Unfortunately, that has gotten us into trouble. And so are we heading for a train wreck? Certainly, without changing practices, the answer to that one is yes. Okay, I'm going to just skim through these slides. These are from the Weed Science Society of America, and they've done lots of good information on weed resistance. But the long and the short of these slides are that you can keep on applying, even with selecting for resistance, increasing your seed bank, increasing your weeds. And for a number of applications, you're not going to see any problems. You will think that you've got excellent control. But as the numbers increase, at one point it goes from looking like it's pretty good control, maybe you missed one or two plants, to having a failure. And this is all because of selection pressure. In this example, of course, it's the same thing year after year. So again, it's not all about the herbicides. And where we normally talk about integrated pest management, because typically we talk about weeds, insect, and diseases as pests, we need to also think about integrated weed management, specifically weeds. So some of the practices that need to be considered, cultural practices, mechanical, and herbicides, of course, are in the mix, but they shouldn't be your only focus. Diversity is really the key, looking at anything that you can mix up, whether it's crop type, crop rotation, timing of seeding, selecting crops that are seeded early, seeded late, fall seeded crops, anything that you can to juggle things up with cropping practices, never mind the herbicide part. So looking at some of the cultural practices, crop rotation, again, we're in a pretty good position in Manitoba and often in Canada, is that we do grow a lot of different crops. A lot of the problems that have developed so rapidly in the U.S. are because they are looking at minimal, if any, crop rotation, and their rotation might be Roundup Ready corn and Roundup Ready soybeans. Those kinds of things are just asking for trouble. So I really think that we're in a good position here in that we are doing a lot of things right already and just have to keep on doing that. There's no point in choosing that type of rotation when we know it's failed for in other locations. Plant populations become huge. Anything you can do to compete with weeds is going to be a good thing. So that means probably looking at increased seeding rates, potentially looking at narrower row spacing, anything you can do to shade over the weeds, looking at planting date. We always think about planting early. I guess the one thing, too, we know from having winter wheat in our rotations or perennial crops is that by looking at a different seeding date. Sometimes you're juggling up the presence of a specific weed. Some weeds, of course, germinate early in the season, some germinate through, some tend to germinate a little later, whether it's based on heat units or moisture or day length, that type of thing. So all these things are part of your whole weed management package. Fertilizer placement, anything you can do to feed the crop and not the weeds is a good thing. And Tammy talked about cover crops a bit. So lots of different management methods to look at, whether it's crop rotation, selecting crops, again, row width or fertilization, even choice of hybrid and variety. Again, different planting times, looking at your fertilizer management. Row spacing, plant populations, seedbed preparation. We have talked about tillage or mechanical operations. That is, we've moved away from the tillage that was very common early on in farming. We've gotten away from fallow for good reason. We want to make sure that we are maintaining our soils, not doing destructive practices. But certainly seedbed preparation is one thing to consider when you're dealing with weeds. And even harvest technique. Whether you're spreading seeds or collecting them, if you have some herbicide-resistant weed options. Tammy talked about the Harrington seed destructor. All these things influence the growth cycle of weed species, and all weeds can have variable growth cycles. Means of dispersal, and of course, water, machinery, wind, human, animals, and birds, lots of issues there. Diverse crop rotations, again, what you're doing with changing up your crop rotations and having many crops in your rotation is you are trying to exploit the differences that can give you some benefit, whether it's in tillage practices, in crop competitiveness, or in herbicide choices, and in all herbicide choices. So mechanical methods, tillage, pre-plant, in-crop, post-harvest. Lots of opportunities, but it can require kind of a mind shift in the way you're addressing your weed management, and it may even require looking at some different machinery options as well. Being proactive, pre-plant tillage, strip or zone tillage, in-crop cultivation, and of course that's easier said than done. But certainly if you are growing row crops, we've had some great herbicide options up till now, but maybe we need to be looking at a bit more cultivation when it's possible. Looking at mowing, sometimes it's just the easy things that you need to have a look at. And Tammy talked about roguing before seed set, and that is absolutely an effective way. I saw my first glyphosate-resistant kochia in Manitoba in around 2013 or 2014. It was in a soybean field. And after applying additional glyphosate, looking at Bazagran as an option, not really having a lot of success with that, the kochia was still coming through. He actually went out and over the summer hand-rogued out all that kochia. It was really remarkable the lengths that he went to. And when I did a follow-up survey a couple of years later, maybe it was 3 years later, it was an 80-acre field. I walked that whole field over an hour and a half. I found one kochia plant in the ditch, and that was it. He had done a really remarkable job of taking care of that. And the good thing about kochia is it's got quite a short seed longevity. It doesn't stick around in the seed bank very long. Mechanical weed control, again, I talked about the reference earlier. Harrington seed destructor, we'll go through these fairly quickly. Wanting to get to the herbicides, because of course that is a key method of weed control for us, and it's going to continue. We just have to make sure that we are looking at it maybe with a different mindset. Looking at mixes, looking at sequences, looking at what herbicides we're going to use across seasons. So in this example, here we go. A little bit busy. This is just giving an example of a not sustainable practice. So season 1, group 9, season 2, group 9, season 3, group 9. So of course this would, whether it was Roundup Ready soybeans or Roundup Ready corn, or 3 consecutive years, absolutely not sustainable. This is more sustainable. You're looking at different crops and you're looking at different herbicide choices. So pretty basic information, but the key note here is careful planning goes into all of this. So again, looking across seasons and keeping a good record of exactly what you're doing. There are a lot of lists that talk about the minimum requirements to look at resistance problems with weeds. They're all a little bit different depending on who developed them. This was one of the first ones I saw. It was Jeff Stockler, a weed scientist from the US. And he talks about a few things which at the time I thought maybe were a little bit questionable, actually. One thing he talked about was maintaining a weed-free zone for field borders and for 100% of your acres. So that means not just looking at the crop that you're going to harvest, but if you have a drainage ditch, a low area, a saline spot, keeping all those areas weed-free as well. And as time goes on, you see more of the value and what wise comment that really is. It's so important to be able to maintain that effectiveness. So, and some things are just strictly choices that we make on the farm. Everybody is always in a rush, but even things like making sure that you've got that you're using the right nozzles and the right droplet size for your herbicide application. Whether you've got a contact herbicide, of course you need more water, finer particles. If it's translocated, maybe you don't need to have as high a water volume, and your droplet size can be bigger and probably should be bigger. Even reducing sprayer travel speeds can be helpful. Okay, I'm just going to breeze through these, I think. Keep records, can't emphasize that enough. Avoid back-to-back in-crop when you're looking at post-emergent applications. Another thing is just thinking about your group selection, looking at mixtures. Can't emphasize scouting. Can't emphasize that enough. One thing that in the good old days, people would go out, they'd make their selection for herbicide based on the weeds that they would find, they would spray it, and often it seemed you didn't really have anything to look at until it came time to harvest. Well, we know different now that we can't take that type of attitude, especially with all the issues that we have. We need to make sure that not only are we scouting to see for what weeds are present, what timing we need to be considering, but also looking afterwards to see what kind of control we have. If we have a huge issue with escapes, how are we going to deal with that? Scouting again in the fall to see if there's any late germinating weeds. Scouting again after harvest to see if there's perennials that might be germinating. And really thinking about if you have weeds that have not been controlled with possibly a pre-seed burn down mix or an in-crop choice, maybe that's the time you really need to be looking at mixing it up and looking at a soil-applied herbicide. Anything that you can do to promote crop diversity. So, getting into the soil residual herbicides, there are issues that you need to contend with. Time management, looking at critical weed-free period, flushing weed control, those are some of the benefits. It does absolutely give you an alternate mode of action, and you can look at multiple modes of effective action. And as Tammy mentioned, herbicide layering may be part of the story. I wanted to throw up kind of a little ad for the field crop Guide to Field Crop Protection. The new one will be coming out this late winter and early spring. And I just wanted to comment that if you haven't had a good look at a guide lately, you really need to, because Tammy and her colleagues have been working really hard to just continue to put good resources, good explanations, good guides into that, into the guide. Lots of information, even just on soil residual herbicides and things to choose. One thing to note, it also lists all the recropping restrictions, how long you have to wait with residual herbicides. Note that these take up about 3 pages, because it's not only the soil applied products you're using, of course it's in-crop ones as well, and some of them are kind of surprising. Lots of description. I'll just run through this one as an example. But an excellent resource when you're making your decisions. Lots of information about herbicide site of action and the chemical family. It's more, I can't think of a good word, more detailed than it has ever been before, but it's also so well described at the same time. Okay, some of the common soil residual herbicides. As I mentioned, we have to remember that it's not just the soil active ones or the soil incorporated ones, it's also post-emergent ones. So again, can't emphasize your record keeping enough. I guess the good thing now is when I was looking at some of the soil applied herbicides, I decided to talk to some of my buddies that I worked with back in the day with Simplot and with Cargill, just to refresh my memory on some of the things that we used to do commonly. And one of the things that one of the fellows pointed out was how important it is to keep those records. But the good thing he said is, especially with the younger fellows, they're always on their phones. Everybody's got auto-steer in their sprayers now, and so some of these guys are keeping excellent records because they have all kinds of time as they're going down the field to be entering data. Now, if you're really active on Twitter, maybe you're not getting your data in as thoroughly, but certainly lots of opportunity, lot better opportunity in some ways of keeping track of what you're doing in your field. Lots of things to consider with factors affecting herbicide persistence. It does get a little bit more complicated, and that's why it's so important to keep good records. Just right off the top, the different soils, the herbicide choice, and even the herbicide rate can vary so much depending on what your location is, what your organic matter levels are, and what your pH is. And that's why I didn't want to get into a whole lot of specific detail in this presentation, because there is so much variability, I could never do it justice in this short period of time. So just a few things to think about. Rainfall is important. The rate is important. Application date, of course. And again, growing conditions following planting. You have to look at temperature for breakdown, how long the herbicide will stick around. Moisture is important if degradation is by microbes. Organic matter and soil texture. If you have higher clay content, that can be a good thing for hanging on to herbicide, but it may delay how long that herbicide sticks around too. Just a quick comment on the soil herbicides again is we have to remember that they're not all the same. Just like with the post-emergent products we're used to, there's differences between the soil-applied ones as well. So trifluralin, in this case, it's highly volatile, so it has to be incorporated very soon after application. It won't wash off with rainfall. But other products aren't volatile, and so in those cases, incorporation may be a detriment. So again, you really have to know your products well, and you have to keep good records. Another thing I wanted to note is all these things are even, when you're looking at soil applied and residual products, it becomes even more important to keep good records because rotational crops subjected to stress conditions such as abnormally hot, dry weather, preceded by extended periods of dry weather for the previous season, injury may occur. So we see injury even with the post-emergent, and what we assume to be very minimal, if any, residue. But if you have the environmental conditions, you can have problems there as well. Okay, I'm just going to run through these very quickly because I want to... I guess the one thing to note here is everybody has made the attempt to get on the same page in dealing with these issues. They have come up with some consistent best management practices. I've talked about most of these already, so I'll just do a very quick run through here. I wanted to get to this, and as I mentioned before, I was thinking about the old days. When I started off with Simplot, there's still quite a lot of soil-applied herbicides used then. We were making the move over to, in particular, Group 1s. So thinking about some of those days, and there were good reasons for making some of the changes. We changed weed management from the soil incorporated to the post-emergent herbicides for a variety of reasons. And ease of application was certainly one of them. Timing was also an issue, level of control. One very important thing that we have to wrap our head around if we do use soil-applied herbicides, the reason we got away from it was because we had the spectacular control, especially with the Group 1s, which was a good thing, increased herbicide selection pressure. With the soil-incorporated herbicides, we have to recognize that our tolerance, our expectations have to be ratcheted down. And it's not a bad thing to not have that perfect control, because it's going to be part of your whole rotation decision, your whole management decision. So again, change in management. Things to think about. Incorporation was a good reason to get away from putting on some of these products, but we have changes in tillage equipment now too, and know a little bit more about what works well. I guess the one thing we have to think about is to be conscious of our tillage equipment too. One thing that we do know is some of the newer machines that we do see out there maybe aren't the best choice for incorporating herbicide. The one that comes to mind is vertical tiller. It has its place. It's terrific at managing residue, sizing crop residue, but as an incorporation tool for herbicide, not a good choice. So again, why did folks get away from doing this? Besides reducing tillage, less risk of wind and water erosion. Certainly in the valley, I lived in Morris, worked in Morris for many, many years. Flooding was always an issue, and with a forecast of an imminent flood, that certainly limited fall applications. I guess one thing to note, as I mentioned, I didn't want to get into a lot of detail because of the variability. And I was asking the guys I used to work with, okay, when we were doing this, we often used to use Treflan for our canola acres. And I said, am I right in thinking that we used to put on quite a bit heavier rate than what was a label recommendation? And the guy said yes. One thing we looked at was certainly if we were applying in the fall, we went at a heavier rate. In the spring, we went at a heavier rate because often we were impregnating dry fertilizer with Treflan. We got better coverage with that. But we also needed to have better coverage of the fertilizer, and so had to increase our herbicide rate because of that. The other thing is all those soils are heavy clays. And when I think about my experiences, I have to say that almost exclusively my clients and customers were dealing with heavier clay soils. So I don't even have that good handle on different soil textures, different pHs, different levels of organic matter. There were lots of things that we could get away with in the valley that somebody else on lighter textured soils, lower organic matter, sometimes even higher organic matter or varying pHs, that they weren't able to do. One good thing about what has come up, though, is although we had gotten away from those products, at one point, one of my friends asked me if I had shares in Truffland and Edge because I was forever talking about trying to get those products back in the rotation. Now we recognize that it is a good thing to juggle up those products. Anytime you're looking at, layering herbicides, we think about some of those herbicide-tolerant crops, such as, whether it's a Liberty canola or a Clearfield canola or even a glyphosate-tolerant canola, We have to start thinking that maybe getting in a soil-incorporated herbicide into that mix is a good choice as well. The guys were reminding me about how we have to make our decisions based on what our long-term plan is. Do we want to cut corners now and have a far bigger impact? Tammy talked about those added costs per acre of dealing with water hemp over and above the traditional herbicide treatments, looking at $60 to $70 an acre and more. In the U.S., they've looked at numbers as high as $250 US per acre. I mean, the value of the crop is higher, but certainly that's a big dollar amount. Sometimes we have to look at short-term pain for that long-term gain. Along with that, I think a really important thing is to make sure that you're asking all the questions. Not just you as a producer, as a farmer, but your agronomist. You need to be talking to each other about these things. And again, I know that some of you folks work very closely with agronomists. Others take a lot of pride in doing it all on your own. But I guess the thing that I wanted to comment on here is having somebody to bounce those ideas off with, those plans with, is always a good thing. To me, and I mean it's my bias coming from that background, I think it's really important to establish a relationship with a local agronomist. And I can think of a couple of really good examples. And I think it'll become even more important as we do try to get more herbicides into the mix, more types of herbicides, the soil-incorporated herbicides. So one of the fellows was telling me that, and it's just in the last 5 years, he had delivered some product out to a field. The fellow was going to put some zinc on with his liquid fertilizer. And as he was driving away, he started to think, wait a second, there were sunflowers on that field last year. I wonder what he did on those sunflowers. And thinking about the farmer, knew that he had used Truffland on a fairly regular basis, called back to the shop to see what had actually gone on in that field. And sure enough, there was Truffland. The farmer had already seeded 60 acres of sunflowers and ended up ripping it up and changing crops just because, or 60 acres, of corn ended up ripping it up because of the risk of the residues of Truffland. So having a local agronomist, it's really just another set of eyes and can be a very valuable set of eyes because you have your mind focused on lots of things about your crop. Their mindset is different because of what they do as their employment. So even just having a set of eyes at the times of year when you're busy with something else, whether it's at harvest, it might be a weed issue, it could be an insect issue. You don't want to depend on your agronomist unless you're paying him well to be your complete manager for those things. But certainly another set of eyes is a really valuable tool to have to deal with some of these issues. So record keeping, although you don't want to be relying on your local agronomist to be doing all your records unless it's somebody that actually is doing that job for you. Remember that you're the one, unless you have them do custom application, they might not remember everything. So in that regard, you can't rely on them to be to know every single thing about your farm unless, again, as I mentioned, they are tasked with keeping those records for you. So, but nothing more important than building relationships with the people who are supplying you with crop input products, but again, even neighbors, keeping an eye out for some of those weed issues. So, take-home message, will this happen to me, dealing with herbicide resistance? Yes, it will, and it probably already has. Is there a magic bullet? No, there's not. So you really need to know what's coming, and Tammy has really covered off that well. There's lots of scary things coming, but knowing that it's going to potentially be an issue for you just makes things better in the long term. You want to just continue making good crop management decisions. And, looking at that zero tolerance thing, this has gotten us into lots of trouble in the past. I kind of like this slide because I think I can get one more year out of glyphosate, and we know that that's not true. So you see those stragglers out in the field, you need to get at them right away. And in crops like this, certainly a soil-incorporated herbicide would be a good choice. Lots of good sources of weed information, including the Canadian Weed Science Society, the Weed Science Society of America, and lots of the information in this presentation. I have to thank Tammy, Rob Golden at the University of Manitoba, Hugh Becky, who was formerly with AAFC, and Jeff Stockler, who I met when he was at NDSU. And with that, I'll wrap it up. And any questions or comments? And I think that maybe if we're going to look at soil-incorporated herbicides with a lot of detail, that we need to set up a workshop.
Okay, this thing's not on.
He'll turn it on right away. Here.
Okay.
Oh, there you go.
Excellent. This is always a challenge, but does anyone have a question out there in the audience? We have a couple of minutes before the next speakers are slated to go. I could ask a million, but I think I agree that it's not a one-size-fits-all, that by the time you take in soil type and the equipment that you've got and everything else that's going on, it's impossible to have like one answer for everything. Is that where you're kind of going with the workshop idea?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And again, it's like, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but as we go down this path and increase our herbicide choices, selections, layering, record keeping has just got to be key in all of this.
Anybody else with a question? Okay. Well, let's give Ingrid a round of applause while I give her small token of appreciation, or she takes her own, because she knows what she's doing here. So thanks so much to Ingrid.